Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Harvey Chace. I've done this kind of thing before. I have a thing about researching airplanes, particularly aircraft that have an interesting backstory. There's an old saying that not all aircraft historians are modelers, but all modelers turn out to be aircraft historians. That is, we want to know where this thing came from that we spend weeks and sometimes months putting together and perfecting in its finish and appearance. So tonight I'm going to talk about an airplane that has a particularly interesting background, and that is the Russian Sturmovik. As someone mentioned earlier before the meeting got started, there's at least 5 different spellings of Sturmovik, and they're all legal as far as I can find out. So feel free to call it anything you like, but it sounds like Sturmovik. Here's a photo of a recently restored Sturmovik in really handsome condition. Now, one of the things that really got me interested in getting after the Sturmovik, again, I'd read a little bit about it. I knew a little bit about it from the World War II history books. But what really kind of threw me for a loop is I read recently interviews, compendium of interviews, P-47 pilots in particular, and they were promoting the notion that it's baloney, well, they used a brighter word than that, baloney to think a P-47 or any other World War II ground attack aircraft could actually kill a tank. Now, we've all seen these P-47 gun camera films, haven't you, where P-47s coming in, and what are they shooting at? They're shooting a train. And you'll see them rake along the train and maybe catch the locomotive. But if you're talking about hitting a tank, think about that P-47 diving at 350 miles an hour if he was aiming at one boxcar. One boxcar. It's a different ballgame. At best, that P-47 pilot or even a Sturmovik pilot has somewhere between 3 and 4 seconds. 3 and 4 seconds from the time that he is a half mile from the target to the point where he's a quarter mile and he begins his pull-up so he doesn't crash into the mountain past the target. So it's a very dicey game. And there's a school of thought now that much of this talk about tank killers was just a myth. So I wanted to read more about the Sturmovik because all of us are familiar with these kinds of pictures. Here's an old Flight Journal magazine, and what does it headline say? It says tank killer. This is a tank killer. He's going to come diving down. I've seen the top of either Rebel or Tamiya, some of these boxes we buy with a Sturmovik model, and there's a picture of a Sturmovik with its 37mm cannons diving in wintertime, and it's a snow scene, and there are all these burning, smoking German tanks there in the snow that have just been destroyed by the Sturmovik. Well, I'm beginning to doubt that, so I did some research. I want to share that with you tonight. I think I have some surprises to show you about the Sturmovik. Now, the way we're going to do this, just a brief outline, let's first talk about the impact of doctrine and culture on how people fight wars. I'm going to contrast the U.S. doctrine versus Soviet doctrine. I think we need to do this so you get an idea of where the Sturmovik came from. What were the Russians thinking? Why were they even trying to build something like this, an armored ground attack airplane? Then we'll talk about its early development on its way to the Great Patriotic War. As most of you know, Russia, the Soviet Union, did not refer to World War II as World War II. It's always been, from their perspective, called the Great Patriotic War. And I want to cover some of the developments that happened once the Sturmovik got in the air and how it adapted its airframe and armament and tactics to survive and become an effective airplane. And we're going to directly address the issue of whether or not it was a tank killer. And we have some new information about that. Finally, in the summary, I'll tell you what I think the impact of the Sturmovik was on military aviation, and at the end, some tips for modelers. So let's begin by talking field. If you don't do that, how is a contractor or any agency ever going to build what you want? You have to tell them what you want, and that's based on doctrine. So here's where we begin with our Sturmovik story, and this is a contrast between U.S. and the Soviet Union. We begin in the 1920s. The U.S. has a cultural imperative, and that is send bullets, not boys. This was engraved on the wall over the main door for the War Department in Washington, D.C. Why are we talking about that? Well, we had just witnessed World War I, and we saw what was going on with the French and the British and the Germans positioning their people in long, muddy trenches and then daring each other to blow the other guy's soldiers up with artillery. The losses were horrible. 6% of the entire adult male population of the United Kingdom died in World War I. A tremendous impact on their progress between the wars. Our participation came late. We suffered about 116,000 casualties, but nothing like what happened to the Germans and the French and the British, who had been at it for a number of years. So we didn't like what we saw. We don't want to fight a war like that. We're the United States of America. We don't have to do that. We're the smartest people in the world. Look at our Industrial Revolution. We don't have to send boys over the top charging into machine guns. When we fight the next war, we're going to do it with superior technology and quality arms. We're not going to send boys. We're going to send bullets. Now, just when the War Department is thinking this through in the late 1920s, along comes a guy named Billy Mitchell, and he said, I got your answer. I know how you can win a war with technology and not sacrifice people. We're going to do it with air power. Air power? Yeah, here's how it works. There's this doctrinaire in Italy, a very erudite guy, and he started this. His name is Giulio Douhet. Perhaps you've heard of Giulio Douhet. And his theme was that the bombers always get through. In this vast sky, big sky, little airplane, nobody is going to see these bombers coming. We're going to fly over the enemy country, fly into his interior, and intimidate the civilian population and destroy his industry. And then his population will be so discouraged, they'll demand that all the troops come home, and they will surrender. So it was just a marriage, a circumstance that occurred here between the theory of air doctrine, of holding the enemy's fatherland, motherland at risk. And this fits so nicely in what the War Department was looking for. They said, you bet, this is it. We're in. Part of that doctrine had a tactical component to it, but the tactical component was only about pre-assault bombing of enemy formations and logistics. The whole notion, the whole words close air support were not part of this doctrine. No one could imagine that you'd have a radio on the ground and some ground commander would be talking directly to a pilot in the air. That was never land. Nobody even thought of it. The premier issue here was strategic air. Hap Arnold got on board, and we began to really look into what it would take to create bomber aircraft that could hold the enemy homeland's resources and industry at risk. So what was the result? What happened after all this 20s and 30s discussion? World War II. The mobilization of World War II limits were set by the War Department. We're going to have 100 divisions. We're not going to have more. That's one way we're going to conserve our population, not put our boys at risk in a horrible war like World War I. We'll figure out how to do it, but we're not going to do it with more than 100 divisions. And here's a real kicker. Maybe many of you already know this. As a result of this policy, 1 out of every 3 GIs walking down the street in 1942 was not in the Army ground units. They were in the Army Air Corps. 1/3 of all the GIs were in the Air Corps. That's quite a dedication to aviation as a solution. Soviet perspective. What's going on over there? Well, you remember the Soviets withdrew from World War I for a number of reasons. One of those is they didn't have any industry. The Soviet Union, before it was a Soviet Union, Russia did not have enough industry to make enough rifles and ammunition to equip their armies. They sent them in the field without weapons. They lost 1.8 million men. And then they withdrew. You all know the rest of the history. Came the Civil War, whites versus reds in Russia. They lost another 10 million Russians in their Civil War. So they came out of this experience a little bit different perspective than us. The Russians thought in the 1920s and 30s, they wrote their doctrine And it said the quickest way to victory is to destroy the enemy's army in the field through application of overwhelming force and extraordinary violence, e.g. masses of infantry, armor, and artillery. We're going to find their army, we're going to double up on them, and we're going to kill them. And we're going to destroy them so effectively that they won't be able to rearm, and they'll all go home. Now, part of this doctrine, which was written by one of the first 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, Marshal Tukhachevsky. Tukhachevsky was also referred to as the Red Napoleon of World War I, and then the war against Poland after that, and then the Civil War. Highly respected guy, great communicator, loved to write theory. So he was the author of this theory. He also included a little corollary in here that he saw in the future the secret to success for the Russian nation. If they go to war, we will need a Sturmovik, essentially a flying tank. A Sturmovik doesn't refer to the aircraft you're familiar with, except generally. That's a general Russian term for an aircraft that is dedicated to ground attack. We need a Sturmovik. It was kind of far-sighted because this has been tried in World War I, and we couldn't do it. We didn't have engines with a power. All we had were wooden frame airplanes with canvas coating, and every time one of those airplanes decided he was going to go down and strafe the enemy's trench, he got his tail shot off. That was not survivable. But Tukhachevsky convinced his Soviet cohorts that the Sturmovik is the answer. We're going to have all this, but on top of that, the Sturmovik is going to be the key to victory. They also were very emphatic that strategic bombing is a waste of time and resources. While you guys are flying your bombers over to their heartland trying to destroy their factories, you're losing people at the front every day, and it's going to turn into a protracted war. You got to get this damn thing over with. Take your casualties up front and end it quickly. You'll come out better in the end. So, how was this implemented when we got to World War II? The Soviet Union mobilized 400 divisions. U.S. 100 divisions to fight the war against Japan and the war in Europe. The Soviet Union fighting Germany mobilized 400 divisions. And we're going to talk about the airplane we're going to talk about today. Here's the IL-2 Sturmovik, 36,000 Sturmoviks. So that's how doctrine drives how countries go to war and what kind of airplanes they build. Now, the Sturmovik is born for a number of reasons. Tukhachevsky, I mentioned, was the author of this doctrine. Between 1928 and 1938, Stalin, I mentioned after World War I, this was a country that couldn't even make rifles and bullets. All the airplanes the Soviets, the Russians flew in World War I were primarily French with a few British thrown in. They didn't have the technology or the industrial power to even build an airplane. And then after 1918, when they backed out of the war, they went immediately into a civil war. They lost another 10 million people. Ever seen the films of West Berlin after World War II? That was the whole country of Russia was in that shape after that civil war, which ended in 1924. So Stalin came to power, and he said, we're going to reorganize things, and we're going to become a great nation. So at the point of a gun, and using purges and sometimes enforced starvation, he moved the entire Soviet population, took the peasants off of their individual farms, moved them to the cities, made factory workers out of them, collectivized the farms, all done by force and intimidation. So with that as background, now we get into the mid-1930s, and here's Marshal Tukhachevsky, authored the Sturmovik Doctrine. Something happened. In 1936, Stalin, a rumor was started that many of the leaders in the Army and the Navy were going to overthrow him. There wasn't any specific information, just rumors. So he rounded up an organization called the NKVD, the secret police, and he said, I want you to go out and find out who all these traitors are, and we're going to get rid of them. In 1936, he had executed 30,000 admirals, generals, colonels, staffs. Anybody above the rank of staff sergeant was in serious trouble. If someone saw you having a beer with somebody who was known to be a traitor, they saw you having a beer with them 12 years ago, and somebody remembers that, you were executed. It was, the end result was he completely decapitated his armed forces. There was nobody left in leadership. 2 out of every 3 division commanders were executed. So along comes, after the execution, Stalin was supposedly personally presiding over the execution, and as they were shooting Tukhachevsky, Stalin's sitting there thinking, you know, I didn't like the guy, but this idea, this thing called a Sturmovik, man, that's my baby. He hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what we need. So even after all this execution and purges, Stalin grabs onto the idea of the Sturmovik. He is the godfather of the Sturmovik. He is the sole person who made sure that it was developed and built. And he told his staff and everybody under him that I want that Sturmovik and I want it fast because I think war is coming. So in number 4 here, we see Mikulin, an engineer in the Soviet Union, gets a beat-up old V-12 engine from the Germans. This is back when they had a treaty one with another and they were sharing ideas. The Germans couldn't do anything with this old V-12. They gave it to the Russians. Here, you guys play with it, see what you can do. Engineer Mikulin organizes this thing, tunes it up, and starts getting about 1,350 horsepower out of it. Well, Ilyushin, very famous Russian design, head of a design agency, hears about Mikulin's 1,350 horsepower engine. He says to himself, I think that's it. If you can get that kind of horsepower out of that engine, I have an idea for a design, and we might be able to do this Sturmovik. So, this is Ilyushin's grand idea. We just passed the Easter holiday, so think about this. Imagine an Easter egg in your backyard that's 12 feet long and 6 feet high, and it's made out of steel, and it's hollow. There it is right there. This was Ilyushin's idea. Never been tried before. There was no internal structure to this airplane. The whole front third of the fuselage, including all the area that enclosed the prop hub and the gearbox, the entire engine, all the fuel tanks, and all the way back to the rear gunner, this was an armored shell. Everything that went inside that armored shell was not connected to any frame that ran through the airplane. It was either bolted or riveted outward onto this armored shell. Now, why did he do that? He said, well, if we put a lot of big, heavy aluminum or steel spars in here, that takes up weight. And then if we put the traditional ribs and stanchions in here to define the shape of the airplane, then we got to wrap aluminum over that, and somehow we got to fit some armor plate in with all that. Well, just forget it. We don't need that. The armor plate is going to be the airplane. Never been done before. So the Stalin thought this was a great idea, gave him the go-ahead. First flight test for the Sturmovik was in October 1939. It failed miserably. The center of gravity was too far aft. It was very difficult to control. The center of gravity was back here somewhere, and the airplane had a tendency to pitch up. And whenever the pilot got in to fly it, depending on airspeed, he was forever pushing the stick forward to keep this thing in the air. It got really bad. If you let the airspeed drop down below about 140, it was almost uncontrollable. So it was rejected. Could not meet the speed requirement of 250 miles an hour, and very few people could learn to fly it. Also had very poor visibility for the pilot. Look how shallow this windscreen is. You couldn't see to land it. Now, a year later, after a year, they make these changes and come back, and they finally pass the test. They reduced the supercharger impeller drag, and they got another 1,620 horsepower out of it now. They sloped the leading edge of the wings back 5 degrees to get more of the center of lift toward the rear of the airplane to overcome this tendency to be ass heavy. And in addition to that, to give the pilot more control over the pitch of the airplane, they enlarged the horizontal stabilizer to give him more surface to counteract the center of gravity issues. But the big thing they did, to save weight and to make it fly, they removed the rear gunner position and the armor that protected the rear gunner. The airplane passed the test. The Sturmovik went into World War II as a single-seat airplane. Now, they made a few more interesting changes before it went into production. They had to solve this problem of a pilot not being able to see the land, so they elevated the pilot's position about 3 inches. They went inside this big eggshell here, the steel shell, and they lowered the engine position by 7 inches, sloped the nose downward so pilots would have a better shot at making a successful landing. At this point, it doesn't look like a fighter airplane anymore. It looks like a Kansas crop duster, doesn't it? The Russian Air Force themselves, pilots called it ugly. They nicknamed it the Gorbaty, which is Russian for hunchback. They also changed the armament plan from 4 30 caliber guns in the wings to 2 30 cal and then 23 millimeter cannons, because if you're going to take on tanks, armored vehicles, 30 caliber is not going to cut it. So we needed these 23 millimeter cannons to make this an effective tank killer, they thought. Now, here's a photo of a model built by a famous Spanish modeler. His name is Ricardo Rodriguez, and it does an excellent job of illustrating how the Sturmovik was manufactured. First of all, we have to remember that aluminum, particularly duralumin, the hardened aluminum we needed for aircraft, was in short supply. So when the Sturmovik went into production, it was made with wooden wings. There were aluminum spars, 2 that went out to the wingtips, but all the ribs and trusses, everything inside the wing was made of wood. The entire back fuselage was laminated plywood. Then we have a steel horizontal stabilizer leading edge, and of course the control surfaces, the elevator back here, the rudder, and the ailerons were made of fabric. There's a little sidelight here to pay attention to. You see these holes right here, and the modeler has cut these open. These represent how you loaded bombs on the airplane. They'd roll a cart underneath the airplane, and they would put an electric winch up here on top of the wing and run the cables down and pick the bomb up off the cart and put it into the bomb bay, which was internal to the wing, and they would latch it in place. Very innovative. Now, let's look at some of the other features of the Sturmovik. First of all, they realized early on the weight of the armor, which was about 1,500 pounds, the fuel load, and the engine weight limited the bomb load. The bomb load of the Sturmovik never got better than about 1,000 pounds. Now you compare that with a P-47 on a strafing mission, and it far exceeded that. I think it was 2,500 pounds, so 4 or 5 500-pounders on the P-47 really outclassed the Sturmovik. I keep using a comparison with the P-47. I think it's something we're all familiar with, and it allows an interesting contrast. The Sturmovik was the same weight as the P-47, but it had 38% more wing area. It had an enormous and very thick wing, a thick airfoil. It was built specifically for low speed, maximum speed of 250 miles per hour. It was a high lift wing, and as I suggested, it was so thick it actually had space for bomb bays, and a very important factor, oversized landing gear. So the Sturmovik was no dogfighter. This thing was going to take off, stay low, stay slow, find a target, and drop its bombs and rockets and do its strafing and go home. It had very little capability to defend itself against other aircraft. Here's a cutaway from the Sturmovik pilot's operating manual. This just illustrates further these bomb bays, and you'll see these if you turn your Sturmovik model upside down. You'll see the lines etched representing these bomb bays. They were side by side in between the wing root and the landing gear in the wing. Each bomb bay was so small it would only fit a 100 kilogram, 220 pound bomb. So there were 2 on this side, 2 on the other side. You're pretty much getting close to a 1,000 pound limit on their weapons load. They also used 3-inch or 5-inch rockets mounted out here under the wooden section of the wing. Because it was wood, that load was limited to something pretty small. If they went up to the more effective 5-inch unguided rocket, they could only put 2 rockets under each wing because they couldn't overstress the wooden structure. Okay. Other features of the Sturmovik. I mentioned the weight of armor, fuel, and engine, limited bomb load, same weight as the P-47. We get down here to something very interesting, and a very stout landing gear for unpaved runways. There was no other single-engine airplane, maybe somebody can think of one, no other single-engine airplane had a landing gear like the Sturmovik. And let me illustrate. On the left is a Sturmovik landing gear. Look at these 2 hydraulic struts here and all these cross members. This thing weighed a ton, maybe not a ton, but close to it. That's around a 36-inch tire. And it looks like the depth might be on the order of 12 inches across. This is a P-47 tire. This is only about 20 inches, and they're holding up the same weight. The PSI on this P-47 tire is probably around 175 PSI. This one's probably around 40 PSI. Now, why did they do this? This is a tremendous burden on an airframe. When you start putting an airplane in the air with the weight and size of this landing gear, you're really compromising how fast it can fly, what it can carry, how far it can go. But back to doctrine. The Soviets assumed that they're not going to fight the next war building runway after runway after runway as they chase the army that they're trying to destroy. This is all going to be done very quickly, and they were going to operate from a bulldozer going across a beet field, leveling it out, and these big fat tires were going to take care of it. Now, so there was sort of the law of unintended consequences. They have this enormous heavy landing gear, which we thought was going to be a great burden and compromise performance. But actually, what happened is so many of these slow airplanes got shot down that the partially exposed wheels of the landing gear actually saved airplanes so they could be salvaged and brought back to their own lines and repaired. Here's the retracted gear. Look at these enormous pods they built. This introduces a lot of drag on the airplane and extra weight. And the best they could do without making a pod as big as the fuselage was to leave about a third of the tire sticking out in the airstream. Now, if you're a Sturmovik pilot and you're hitting a target on the other side of the lines and you get shot up on ME-109, if you got enough altitude and energy, all you got to do is turn that thing around 180 degrees because you're going to be right close to your front, and your friendly forces are right behind you. So most of the Sturmoviks crash landed on their own side of the fighting line, and when they did, these exposed wheels prevented any extensive damage to the fuselage, and many of these were salvaged. Now, if you go to the Soviet publications, even after the fall of the Berlin Wall and warming relations, they're still bragging about the fact that 70% of all the Sturmoviks that crashed were recovered. I think that's a bit of braggadocio. But that's the source we have. Now, other unique features of the Sturmovik, it had something that was unusual early in the war. This came later in the P-47, P-51, and other aircraft. It had a pneumatic system, not a hydraulic system, pneumatic system for lowering the gear and the flaps. And guess what? They extended the pneumatic system to the wing guns. So if they had a jam, all a Sturmovik pilot had to do was press a lever, and the pneumatic piston out there next to each gun would cycle the operating handle, dispose of the bad round that wouldn't fire, and they could shoot again. Very innovative. What I want to focus on here now is the CO2 canister charge. This was also very interesting. I found out there was one American airplane that had this system. It's the F-4U Corsair. The late war models of the Japanese Zero and other Japanese aircraft had the same system. This was just a compressed bottle of CO2. And when one is entering combat, the strategy was to reach down, and it had a screw top, just like the top on your propane bottle on your barbecue. And you just open that baby up, and it would shoot pressurized CO2, and that would occupy the voids, the airspace above the half-full fuel tank. So if you took a incendiary round, it was less likely to catch fire or explode. Pretty smart for that time, and very innovative. Another thing I want to share is something you've never seen before, and I'll bet nobody in this audience has seen it before unless they've been studying the Sturmovik. Anybody know what the DAG system was? Heard of that before? Great, you're about to hear about it. This is the DAG system. In the fuselage behind the pilot and the gunner, when the gunner was part of the airplane, there was this chute right here, this vertical magazine, and packed in here were 5-pound grenades packed in a parachute. So if a pilot timed it just right, and he was looking in his rearview mirror, and he figured that ME-109 was about 3,000 yards back, he pull a lever, and 10 of these bomblets would pop out on these little parachutes behind the Sturmovik, and they're bobbing along out there in these parachutes, and here comes ME-109 trying to line up for a shot, and these grenades are going off all around him. Now, there's no record of any German fighter aircraft being shot down by these grenades, but it certainly was distracting, and it turned out to be a fairly effective defensive weapon for them.
In the form of chaff.
Exactly. Yeah, you might say it's exploding chaff. Another interesting story about this has to do with Russian culture more than anything else. During the history of the Sturmovik, during its development in World War II, when they began operations after the Germans invaded, there was only one radio in the flight, and that was the leader. That was by design. That's how they wanted it from the factory. You know, one out of every 10 airplanes will have a radio, which meant that the leader could not communicate with anybody else in the flight. So I suppose before they took off, the flight leader said, "Follow me and do what I do." It really limited the communication. The leader's radio was communicating with ground units to find out where his target was. It wasn't until 1943 that they decided that maybe the boys flying wing here and the rest of the formation maybe really didn't understand wagging wings and all the signals he was trying to do with his hand. So they installed receive-only radios in all the wingmen's airplanes. Receive only. The problem is, if you can only receive and the flight lead gives you instructions, do you have any way to acknowledge that you heard the instructions? No, because you can only receive, you can't transmit. Finally, 1944, the waning months of the war, every Sturmovik came off the production line with everyone had both a receive and a transmit radio. So then the wingmen could start saying very interesting things like, "Comrade leader, you have an ME-109 on your tail." So this really improved the effectiveness of the Sturmovik. But go figure, what a crazy idea. Before we go any further, I want to do another recap on the P-47 and the Sturmovik. Let's look at the weapons load here. P-47 is carrying 8 5-inch rockets. Sturmovik only 4. Look at the low explosive weight on the Russian, the Soviet rocket, because that whole tube, instead of being loaded with explosives, high explosive, it was propellant. The Soviet spec for this thing is that rocket would go 2 miles. Now, who the hell is going to hang a rocket under his airplane and shoot at a tank from 2 miles away? It was a complete screw-up in a technical sense. The explosive weight of the 5-inch rocket on the P-47, 7.8 pounds, a lot more punch. Bombs. Bomb load on the P-47, 2,500 pounds, about 1,000 pounds on the Sturmovik. Guns, 850 calibers on the P-47, most of you know that. They carry 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. The Sturmovik's got 1,500 rounds of 30 caliber and 300 rounds for its 23 millimeter cannon. Quite a difference. Now, Modelers want to know about exterior markings. What did this thing look like when it got in the field and began to fly? Well, there's a couple of things I want to point out on this photograph. First thing I want to call to your attention is the wing root. Now, I remember I said earlier they load their bombs up here. They put a winch down through the wing and bring the bombs up this way. Well, keep in mind they're operating from dirt fields, literally beet fields, filled with gravel, rocks, all kinds of debris. So what happens very early in the Sturmovik's life is the paint wears off on this track right here. You find very few Sturmoviks that had any paint left there. Now, notice that the markings are limited to large numbers. This number represented the regiment to which they were assigned. So when you're in a formation, there's a formation over there and there's one over there, and you're just pulling off a bomb run, and you're looking around for your fellow boys and girls. You look for your regiment number, and that's your group. That was the purpose of it. Notice there are no serial numbers. Every P-51, P-47, every B-24 has a serial number right here, not the Soviets. I don't know what their concern was. Maybe they thought that the Germans would interpret that and figure out how many of the airplanes they actually had. So the only place you could find the serial number was up here in the wheel well. Somebody else mentioned this evening sometimes on an outer wingtip on the bottom there was a stencil with the aircraft serial number. Also notice there are no girls in bikinis, no Mickey Mouse up there on the nose, unlike American airplanes and the Brits as well, sometimes the Germans. What was put on the airplane was very strictly controlled. There was a political officer assigned to every regiment, every aviation regiment, who dictated what could be put on the airplanes. So here's another example here. The only thing they could decorate the airplane with were political slogans like "Death to the Fascists" and "I fight for Stalin." And this one right down here says literally, this was a commemorative airplane. The people who at the factory who manufactured it put this writing on here, and it says, "To our compatriot hero of the Soviet Union, Comrade Pavlov, from the workers of the Kustani factory." So that was it. No funny business. This was serious work for the Russians. Another interesting marking. Does this mean that this airplane shot down this many Russian airplanes? No. As a more educated person filled me in, that this, if it was Americans or Brits, we'd paint little swastikas on the side of the airplane indicating how many kills the pilot had. This was a ethnic, cultural, nasty, dirty war between the Germans and the Russians. The Russians could not abide having any symbol painted on their airplane that represented the Germans. So they chose to use stars instead of swastikas. Okay, June 22nd, 1941, the German invasion began. Only 70 Sturmoviks were available when the surprise German invasion began that June. And in those 70 Sturmoviks, they were a curiosity. They're sitting there on the pad. Nobody knew how to fly them. Very few instructors. They didn't know what to do with the airplane. There was no operating manual. They didn't have any tactics. There was no school. They took basic trainees out of basic pilot training and brought them into the Sturmoviks. And here was the check ride. If you could take this thing off and land it without killing yourself, you're good to go. Load the guns, put some bombs on it. You've never fired the guns, you've never dropped a bomb, but head for the front, boy. And that's how they began to fight the war in 1941. Now, production began to ramp up, trying to keep up with the threat. The other problem they had early on in the war was this lack of the rear gunner. Now, we had poor pilot training. They didn't know how to defend themselves. They didn't know what defensive measures they should use. They were really poorly trained. They lacked any tactics instructions at all. And this all added up to a record of 6 sorties. 6 flights was the lifespan of a Sturmovik in 1941. Fortunately, this high crash recovery rate helped to sustain the force, and probably a conservative, most conservative estimate was that 70% of the pilots were recovered and about the same number of aircraft, at least parts and pieces they could use to rebuild the remainder of the fleet. Now, another thing that caused this six-sortie problem is the Soviets had a policy. They thought that if you're a Sturmovik pilot, if you come back to the base with any bomb not dropped, any rocket not fired, and without your gun magazines completely empty, you were going to be punished. They had a penal colony, a penal flight, where they put all the bad boys who didn't use all their ammunition, and they gave them the worst assignments and made them fly the lead on the most difficult missions. So there was quite an incentive to expend everything you took into the air. What did this do? Well, now you've hit a target, and now you've got in a Sturmovik that flies at best 250 miles an hour. Where are you? You're circling over the front looking for another target. I mean, that's like, you know what they call water skiing in Louisiana? It's trolling for crocodiles. Well, these guys were trolling for crocodiles. They're sitting up there, and the Germans are taking pot shots at them with anti-aircraft. Me-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s are diving down on them, shooting them out of the sky. They didn't have a good escort with them in the early years, 41, 42, and they lost a tremendous number of airplanes. So it was policy as much as anything else that caused the demise of so many Sturmovik pilots. To go on. Now, several of the things I wanted to mention very briefly. You have no tactics. What are we going to do? How are we going to fly? How are we going to survive? Well, the first thing they did is the first tactic they used was they flew at treetop level, so it would be harder for the Russian fighters to find them. And they had a PE-2 dive bomber, Russian aircraft, that was called a Sturman. And it would fly at high altitude, identify a target, roar down in a dive at 400 miles an hour, drop incendiary bomblets on a column of perhaps vehicles or troops in the open. And what the Sturmovik pilots did while they're just flying at treetops, they would look for the rising smoke. And where they saw rising smoke, they flew there, and that's how they bombed their target. Another interesting thing happened early in the war is the Germans found out a neat way to shoot down a Sturmovik. As I said, this is a big Easter egg. By the way, this is made out of homogeneous rolled steel. Not steel plate, homogeneous rolled steel. That's 15% stronger than any steel that we used on our tanks or U.S. aircraft. So it was pretty stout, but they didn't have room for this down here. This is the oil cooler for this big V12 engine. And it's armored. It's got quarter-inch steel on it, light armor, but it's hanging down below the airplane. This is where the engine oil is circulated and cooled. So what the Germans found out they could do, if they can catch a Sturmovik that's flying along at about 2,000 or 3,000 feet, you can come up under it, underneath from the back, put a couple of rounds through the back door of this oil cooler, and this thing is going to have its oil drained faster than Jiffy Lube. And the engine's going to seize and the airplane's going to crash. Now, the most significant event that happened during the war regarding Sturmovik production was the evacuation of the factories around Moscow. Now, when Stalin decided he was going to reorganize the entire country, he wanted to keep track of what was going on. He wanted it right in front of him. So he built all these factories, manufacturing factories, heavy machinery, were all in the outskirts of Moscow. Well, along comes October 1941. The Germans have been just kicking the stuffing out of the Russian army. The Germans are actually within, who's that? Anyway, ignore that. The Germans are actually within 12 miles of the gates of Moscow. Now the Russians are really nervous. If they capture Moscow, they'll capture all of our production facilities and we'll be out of the war. So beginning in October 1941 through January 42, the Soviets actually moved 1,500 factories and 500,000 workers 1,000 miles eastward into the Ural Mountains to avoid these resources being bombed or captured. So the Sturmovik production was part of that. Now, here's something that, here we go. We can't advance. What, I need some help. I don't know where this, so you may remember, you've seen in the history books, if you've read anything about the Sturmoviks or about the Soviets' participation in World War II, Stalin sent a telegram to the aircraft plant managers out in the Ural Mountains. Now, these guys just moved out there. They trekked or rode horses 1,000 miles out to the Ural Mountains. They got there. There were some factory floors laid out. There were no roofs on the buildings. They built campfires on the factory floor to stay warm, and they're trying to make Sturmovik airplanes. But nothing is coming out the delivery door. So Stalin sends this message. You have let down our country and our Red Army. You have the nerve not to manufacture IL-2s until now. Our Red Army needs IL-2 aircraft like the air it breathes, like the bread it eats. Schenkman produces 1 IL-2 a day, and Tretyakov builds only 2 MiGs daily. This is a mockery of our country and the Red Army. I ask you not to try the government's patience, and I demand that you manufacture more IL-2s. This is my final warning. Now, if you've lived through the 1920s and 30s in Russia and you get that message from Stalin, you're going to get off your ass and you're going to be working 24 hours a day or you're going to be shot. Yeah. So obviously production picked way up. Now, after Stalin's warning, production did rise to 8,000 units in 1942. So now they're getting more units to the front. More pilots are coming in. They're finally building up the Sturmovik force. And in early 42, Sturmovik regiments began to field modify their aircraft to add a gunner. They actually went out there with hacksaws. The pilots, after they landed, went out with hacksaws and cut a circular pattern behind the pilot cockpit. They went around to any crashed Soviet airplane. We don't care if it's got a 50 caliber gun or a 30 caliber or quads, whatever. We're going to bolt those machine guns on the edge of this hole we just cut in the back of the airplane, and we're going to get our gunners back. And somebody said, oh, but the aft center of gravity is going to make the airplane even more dangerous to fly. And they said, we're dying anyway. So they actually modified 1,200 airplanes, the single-seat airplanes, and returned the gunner to that position and struggled through the aerodynamic forces that made this thing harder to fly. Here's a picture. Here's the cut they made behind the pilot position right here, the canopy. Now this is armored glass. Remember, we got armor all around the pilot, which is a good thing because he's got a fuel tank in front of him. He's sitting on a fuel tank, and there's a fuel tank right behind him and the gunner. So, but the gunner, since that wasn't a position that was modified in the field, there's no armor, no protection back here at all, and the number of gunners lost was significant. But this shows you what a Sturmovik looks like when it's on its way home. Now this picture, once again, we're worried about aft center of gravity, and is the airplane even going to be flyable? So they didn't give this rear gunner any comforts. All he had to sit on was this canvas strap. Rocking back and forth on this canvas strap, shooting the gun. There's no seatbelt here. No seatbelt. So these field modifications helped somewhat, but this only addressed a fraction of the airplanes that were engaged in combat, a small fraction actually. They had about 8,000 or more left over from earlier production and new production. So this is just a minority of airplanes that got this modification. But they also began to improve their tactics in 1942. And this was called the Circle of Death. Sturmoviks would, if they're going to attack a German column, they would first establish a circular flight pattern. And they would enter their descent and dive here and roll out and do their bombing and strafing and then get back in line. So if an Me-109 comes in here, this guy is going to shoot him down. If he comes in here, this guy's going to roll in behind him and shoot him down. So it was kind of a primitive means of protection. And those of you who are up on World War I aviation, this is simply the Lufbery circle.
Or circling wagons.
Exactly. Now this is I want to pause here because now as more Sturmoviks come online, we started out with 12 in a flight. Of course, 4 of those were always going to be in damaged condition or shot down. You might actually launch a flight with 6 or 8 airplanes, not enough to attack a target. More airplanes are coming into the front. So what can we do? All right, we're going to take some of these airplanes and we're going to dedicate them to suppressing the AAA. And that will save the other airplanes so they can do more effective bombing and survive the mission. This is a very interesting weapon, not used anywhere else in World War II. The AZH-2 is a phosphorus sulfur incendiary bomb. It had these peculiar cuts in it, so it would break on impact. It would break on impact and spark. Now, the phosphorus and sulfur are suspended in aviation fuel. So when this thing hits the ground, it pops open, the spark ignites the sulfur, it gives a little pop like a Molotov cocktail. We're talking about, it's going to go 10 yards in all directions. Does anybody know anything about phosphorus as a weapon?
Yeah,
it wasn't outlawed. The Germans wanted it outlawed, but Geneva Convention said, go for it, boys. So this thing would spray little particles of phosphorus all over the track they were attacking, in particular unprotected anti-aircraft. Now this would really raise hell with these guys. If you get a little lump of phosphorus lands on your uniform, the first thing it's going to do, it ignites when it comes in contact with air. It burns at 1,500 degrees centigrade. The first thing it does is it burns through your uniform, and then it sticks to your skin. And it keeps on burning all the way down until it is exhausted, usually when it hits a bone. This is a horrible weapon. And the German anti-aircraft suffered terribly from these phosphorus bombs. By the way, if you think this is a potent weapon, this gun assembly was made by Rheinmetall. They made thousands of them. They sent them to the Russian front to protect their convoys from Sturmoviks. It's a 20 millimeter, very effective against a Sturmovik if you can get them in your sights. There's a pedal down here that is the firing mechanism. Each of these guns, they designed the receivers of these guns to handle a shell that had a 2,000 meter range. It was a very healthy shell, and we're talking about a honking receiver on that gun. The problem was, if you want that projectile to go that far, that's a hot round. So Rheinmetall said, whatever you do, don't fire more than 3 rounds per second. So it's going to go put, put, put in one of these, and another one's going to go put, put, put. Not exactly like a machine gun, may I suggest. The other thing Rheinmetall did to prevent the troops from melting down the barrels of this gun, they put a separate canister magazine on each one of these guns. There were only 20 rounds in a magazine. So in about 4 seconds, 4 or 5 seconds, your gun's empty. And then these guys are scrambling around all over each other, trying to reload these guns individually with another 20-round magazine, while they're being bombarded with phosphorus. Some other interesting modifications occurred about this time. That is midway through 1942, they're noticing that the tank kills that they'd counted on, this is our tank killer, it's not materializing, even with a 23 millimeter gun. That the poor, very shallow pilot training and the tactics they were using were not killing the tanks that everyone anticipated. They were tearing up everything else in the countryside, but the tanks weren't, German tanks were not suffering from the Sturmovik. Now around this time, the survival rate increases to 12 sorties. And that's because they were using the Luftwaffe circle for their mutual defense. And also we're seeing these modifications bringing the gunner back, these field modifications. So in late 42, we're seeing the sortie rate go up to 12. 12 sorties before the Sturmovik is lost, typically. So Stalin and the factory finally gave up. All the boys are saying they need the rear seat gunner. We got to do something. So starting in late 42, early 43, all the factories for the Sturmoviks converted to the two-seat configuration again. They didn't add full armor back here. They only gave them about a 1/4 inch. But they brought the gunner back, and to try to keep better control of the aircraft, they actually extended the fuselage a few inches to get more leverage for the elevator, so the airplane would stop pitching up when they were flying. Great Patriotic War, IL-2 employment. The first interesting incident for the Sturmovik happened at the Battle of Stalingrad. This is December 42 through February 43. You remember at that time the German 6th Army was completely surrounded. They had 500,000 German soldiers were surrounded by the Russians west of Stalingrad. And the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring said, "Don't worry, we're going to resupply them by air." So they tried. This is the Sturmovik, not as a ground attack airplane. The Sturmovik turned out to be an interceptor. It was extremely effective because it flew near the speeds of these Junker 52 transports that were resupplying the Stalingrad cauldron, they called it. They lost 467. The Germans lost 467 Ju-52s to Sturmoviks at Stalingrad. But eventually the 6th Army surrendered, and they lost 500,000 soldiers.
And only 115,000 came back.
That's right. So, now in 1943, another interesting thing happened. German fighters aren't there anymore. Well, they're there, but not in the numbers they used to be. Well, where did they all go? Well, they took their best pilots and best airplanes, took them off the Russian front, sent them westward to confront the B-17s and Lancaster bombers that were attacking the heartland of Germany. So that really eased up the threat from fighter aircraft on the Sturmovik. And then also, they had some new air-to-air tactics they were using. And also note that P-39s began to arrive. There were 2,600 P-39s, who turned out to be a perfect escort for the Sturmoviks. 2,643, another 2,244. There was a little less than 5,000 in total made it over there to support the Russians. The Russians loved the P-39. It was a perfect airplane for them. Its performance at low altitude would match the Me-109. Second significant occurrence for the Sturmovik was the Battle of Kursk. You all know about the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. This is where, whoops, went too far here. Yeah, there it is. Look at the size of these pods that carried the 37mm cannon. When you put these things on the airplane, they could carry no bombs, no rockets, no other armament except these heavy pods for the 37mm, and each pod only had 50 rounds for each gun. 50 rounds. So his 37mm got quite a kick. So what happened when they went up and tried to hit tanks with 37mm? They would fire. They weren't synchronized. They couldn't be. They're on opposite wings. So what would happen is the one on the left wing would fire and move the airplane that way. Then the right wing would fire, and then the left wing and the right wing. They were scattering 37mm rounds all over the countryside. And the Russians themselves, they hate to admit an error, but they found out only 3% of a 37mm round hit a target. So fortunately, they only made 1,175 of these, and it wasn't a complete commitment, but it was a complete failure. So when you buy a model of a Sturmovik, or maybe you have one home on the shelf, if it's got those really interesting long 37mm guns on it, they were worthless. So, all right. So this is my position right now. I feel like the Mythbuster. Remember that thing on TV, the Mythbuster series? I feel like the Mythbuster because it's my opinion the Sturmovik was not an effective tank killer. I don't know, I'm not going to write an article about it. Maybe somebody else will, but it didn't do the job with the weapons they hung on the Sturmovik up to that point. Now, see that word? Until. Until what? The Protivo Tankovaya Bomba. Protivo Tankovaya Bomba. This is a shaped charge. A shaped charge munition. It only weighs 5 pounds. Got little fins that flip out in the back to stabilize it on the way down. It's the same technology we used in the Panzerfaust and U.S. bazookas. This P-tab, when it strikes a flat surface of armor, it will go off and it will penetrate 70 millimeters, about 3 inches of armor. This will take out a Panther tank or a Tiger tank. And these were first used at Kursk, along with the 37 millimeter guns. Now I want to show you a very brief, let's see here. Where? Okay, this is, nope, didn't work. Okay, this is a shaped charge. How does a shaped charge work? We got any Army artillery officers here? Thought we had one. Oh, anyway, shaped charge. Here's what happens. It doesn't matter. Here's the top of the tank. It doesn't matter if this bomblet is going 5 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour, because the speed at which it strikes the armor has nothing to do with its power. But when it strikes and sends an electrical signal back here, that sets off a very volatile propellant, which in turn ignites the less volatile propellant. This whole thing melts down suddenly. This is called a Wagner effect. It melts down and turns this copper liner into a bolt that is traveling at hypersonic speed. And this shot of copper, and it's based purely on kinetic energy. We're not necessarily melting the copper. We're squeezing it down into a bolt, and it'll go right through the armor with a hole about the size of a .45 caliber. Well, that's not going to disarm anything, is it? This son of a gun is going so fast that before it exits this side of the armor, it starts peeling off pieces of armor inside the tank and spraying them all over the place and taking out the crew. So the P-tab, not the 37 millimeter gun, not the bombs and rockets. The P-tab made this an effective weapon. What I've done is I've sketched. Also note that the Sturmovik, believe it or not, with these little tiny bomb bays, they found a way to pack 192 P-tabs into each Sturmovik. Now this is their typical drop pattern, 50 feet by 230 feet. What I've done is I've superimposed a silhouette of a Tiger tank in this field of P-tabs, and you can see even if they weren't perfectly aligned, this Sturmovik's going to come across that column, and he's going to get some hits, and he's going to disable some tanks. So obviously Stalin was impressed. His Sturmovik is finally working. He immediately orders that they produce 1 million P-tabs. And for the rest of the war, after Kursk, when the Russians are chasing the Germans all the way back to Berlin, they were killing tanks with P-tabs. Great Patriotic War, another interesting note, in 1944, we get to the point where mid-44, they changed the airplane. They went from a 5-degree sweep back on the wing to 15 degrees. Now, did this make it go faster? No. Why did they do it? They're trying to get the center of lift further back to counteract the problem they're having with the airplane being tail heavy. And this worked marvelously. Now, before they did this, I was trying to think of an appropriate anecdote. If you're flying a Sturmovik, it's always going to be, you're always going to have forward pressure on some forward pressure, 10 pounds, 15 pounds, 20 pounds on that stick, because it's ass heavy. It wants to flip up and it wants to roll over and kill you. So you can never, ever be distracted. You must keep forward pressure on that stick. It would be like if you had a Great Dane on a leash and you were walking across a field of house cats. In one moment of inattention on your part, you're going for a ride you didn't plan on. And that's exactly what it was like flying a Sturmovik, and this was the solution. Notice that fully half of those produced, 17,000, had the swept wing. Okay, weakness of the Sturmovik. It wasn't employed very well. There weren't enough dedicated fighters to cover it through much of the war. It was forced to loiter at low altitude, couldn't bring home any ordnance. And that really accounts for the number that were lost. The Russians say 11,000. The U.S. estimates are 20,000 out of the 36,000 were shot down by other aircraft or by anti-aircraft guns. It was poor results against German armor until the PTAB very late in the war. There was a 30% accident rate. I haven't mentioned this earlier. All things being equal, all these other challenges they had to face, 30% of them were lost to accidents before they ever got to the target. And of course, it was plagued with a very modest weapons load because of the heavy weight of the aircraft. These are the factors contributing to Sturmovik's success. Extraordinary production numbers. As Stalin said, quantity has its own quality. In some cases, late in the war, when the Russians were pursuing the German army into their own territory, they had so many Sturmoviks. There was one Sturmovik for every 41 feet of front where the armies opposed each other. 41 feet. Got its own airplane. Of course, the redeployment of the Luftwaffe helped a great deal. 43, 44, they were diverted back to protect their country. And of course, the arrival of P-39 escorts in 43 and 44 had a very positive effect. Now, but the big thing that made the Sturmovik a success was the Germans gave them soft targets. What do you mean they gave them soft targets? Okay, back to 41, Barbarossa. 3.5 million men assembled in Poland, ready to invade the Soviet Union. 80% of the German army was not mechanized. Not tanks, not trucks, not self-propelled artillery, none of it. 80% of the 3.5 million were non-mechanized. They were on foot. There were 3,000 tanks in that invasion assembly. That's 2,500 aircraft. But how did German troops and material normally win? How did they travel? How did they conquer France? They did it on trains from the get-go. Germany had no automotive industry. Their entire army strategy was to move by train. But what happened when they got to the border with Russia?
Tracks are different gauge.
The tracks are a different gauge. The tracks are the same in Poland and Germany and France and Italy. All over Europe, you get to Russia, German trains don't fit. So what are you going to do? You're going to stop the trains, download all the material you want to support the army, and you're going to take it forward. Well, how can you do that? Look at this. Can you imagine this number of animals? The low estimate was 600,000. Some people say 750,000 horses drug the army's supplies and material across Russia to support their armored columns. So, talk about soft targets. If you're a Sturmovik pilot and you're rolling in on this road and you look down there and you see all the stuff that looks like the Budweiser wagon coming at you times about 150, oh, that's going to be wonderful. So that's what the Sturmovik did. So here's a picture from the German invasion of Russia, World War II. They went into Russia the same way Napoleon did in 1812. The same way. So the Sturmovik's greatest probable contribution was chewing up all these soft targets. The Germans gave them soft targets. The German infantry labeled the Sturmovik the Fleischer, which in German means butcher. And they did it for good reason, because the IL-2 didn't kill tanks outright. The IL-2 destroyed everything the tank needed to succeed. All of its supplies, all of the hoists for changing engines, all the material that goes forward with those troops was drawn in by horses on wagons, and the Sturmovik destroyed the tanks by destroying their support. Okay. The historic significance of the Sturmovik, we all know what it is. It was all these wonderful things it did, I mentioned before, and it was the inspiration later for the USA-10 and the Russian Su-35. The first armored, dedicated ground attack airplane. Now, tips for modelers. I got a book here. There are 24 color plates in here. If anybody is interested in building a Sturmovik, you can borrow this from me, and you have lots of choices on camouflage patterns, both summer and winter. I'll leave it here on the table for you to look at when you want to. Now, and finally, what everybody hopes for, the end of the presentation. Is anybody busting a bladder out there? Got to run out and go to the bathroom? Sir, Mike. Yeah.
Any indication that the pilots jettisoned their ordnance so they weren't fired?
Yes. Yes. There were many instances when the pilots, because they were worried about what's going to happen to them over the front, over the target, many instances of Soviet pilots jettisoning their munitions. But in most cases, they were reported by their cohorts in the flight, and they were sent to the penal colony. Now, I didn't mention much about the penal colony, but if they couldn't find a gunner for the back of the Sturmovik, penal colony. If there was a particularly dangerous mission that when they knew they were going to get shot to hell, you put the bad boy in the first airplane. So it was quite common. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Stalin just gutting the upper officer corps.
Yes.
I read something someplace that was actually brought about by one of the greatest intelligent coups the Germans ever accomplished. A letter got to Stalin's desk. The Germans.
Right.
Is that what caused that?
Yes, well, not so much. There was a lot of intelligence and rumors flying around. It was absolutely true that the Germans, who captured Tukhachevsky during World War I, he escaped from German prison camps in World War I 4 times. They finally stuck his ass in a castle somewhere in Bavaria to make sure he couldn't get out again. So he returned, and he was obviously very prominent in the Civil War, very successful, and he was one of the first 5 marshals. It has been proven that the Germans planted correspondence in the Czech embassy, and they left it in the open so that they knew the Germans would, their German spies would find it. They found it, and it implicated Tukhachevsky in a revolution against Stalin. So when Stalin found this out, I mean, that was an incident that involved Tukhachevsky himself. It didn't. The other purge that went on was sponsored by the NKVD and not necessarily related. But when he executed Tukhachevsky and kept his idea about the Sturmovik, he also, Russian policy, he executed his wife. And then he went out to the military academy, the Soviet military academy, where Tukhachevsky's brothers were teaching, and he executed them. Tukhachevsky had a 14-year-old daughter. As soon as she reached the age of majority, I think it was 16, they put her in a gulag. This is a tough bunch of people.
You mentioned the CO2 business.
Yeah.
A friend of mine for a while owned the Sukhoi Su-26.
Yeah.
Aircraft.
Uh-huh.
They started them with compressed air. It did not have an electric starter. The strangest sounding thing you've ever heard.
Well, and so, why, what kills me is this landing gear on the Sturmovik. I mean, you could have plowed a field with that airplane. I mean, it was enormous, and an enormous weight for them to bear. But back to those kinds of questions, why did they have an compressed air system for their landing gear, their flaps, and charging the guns on the Sturmovik? Hydraulic fluid is hard to come by. Air is free. All you need is a compressor.
Well, I always thought the reason they might have, because the radial engine that was in that thing was used, they first came about in the late 30s.
It was
in the Russian winter.
Yeah.
a lead acid battery ain't gonna do you much good, but compressed air might.
Yeah, well, that's true too. You know, right after the Sturmovik was approved with a liquid-cooled engine, they tried it with their best recently developed radial engine. It produced about the same amount of horsepower, but the radial engine created much more drag because of the face of the engine, and they decided they would go with the old V12. Sir.
At the beginning of your presentation, you talked about the difference in American and Soviet war doctrine. The doctrine that the Soviets used, that you pointed out, involved the use of overwhelming force at the front to smash the enemy. That's exactly the strategy that Zhukov used against the Japanese at Kulkin Gol in 1939.
Yeah.
He scored an overwhelming victory using that tactic.
Yeah.
Eventually, that led to the Pearl Harbor attack, because the Japanese realized they're not going to be able to fight the Soviets. So they changed their entire war strategy to the South Pacific.
Oh, you reminded me. Thank you for that question. That PTAB they're dropping, 80 years later, that's exactly what the Ukrainians are dropping on Russian tanks. Exactly.
That's true.
Anything else?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chace.